Let me know when I can continue.
Yeah.
Okay. So as I was saying, I represent the Open Glossary Edge Computing, which is a Linux Foundation project, and I'm doing the work to liaison with other groups that have an active interest in advancing the industry around common terminology. And there's a project that I'm just about to kick off, which is gaining quite a bit of momentum. So one of the things when I've gone to people in the community and I've asked for feedback, one of the things they've asked to do, particularly if they have an active interest in an area of edge. So the three big areas are the infrastructure edge, the device edge, and then the software stack. And I've gotten a number of requests to sort of go 2 or 3 levels deep on a taxonomy for those different areas. So iMasons and the TIA are working on an edge infrastructure taxonomy. And I'm looking for volunteers to help with the software stack and or the device edge taxonomy. And we're going to call it the Taxonomy Project, and again, run it as part of the open source effort in the Linux Foundation. So if anybody would like to, has any interest, just drop me an email or hit me up in chat during this meeting, and I'd be happy to involve you. And I will continue to report to this group and let you know progress.
Great. Have you kind of gathered the first order of just inventories of taxonomies that are already done, and then are you looking to kind of blend those into?
Yeah. So yes and no. So when we did the State of the Edge project, which the Glossary spun out of, we did do a pretty comprehensive taxonomy, but to be honest, we didn't go as deep as some of the working group folks want to go. So for instance, iMasons, they're at the Edge meeting in Austin, and they're crowdsourcing taxonomies, and they're going deep into things like cooling, resilience, size of data centers, things like that. So my goal here would be to take the existing work in the open glossary, but also to task the working groups with identifying, existing material that we could leverage.
I guess my other quick comment is, have you been looking at the work done in the kind of first white paper from this group to see if there's any conflict in kind of definitions, or do you think what we have is pretty well aligned?
I think it's pretty well aligned because we seeded it with the concepts from the Open Glossary, and I've been involved with the CNCF since its foundation, so I think it is fairly well aligned. But I think we should attempt to fully align them before the paper goes out. And the way we're approaching this is, it's like I said, it's an open source project sitting in a GitHub repo. Anybody can raise pull requests or issues. And what I would propose is maybe when we get to the point where we've locked down on some of the terminology for this working group, that maybe 1 or 2 of us go and rationalize that with what's in the Open Glossary. And then if we want to propose changes to harmonize them, I can steward those.
And just so I'm making sure I'm looking at the right one, the current GitHub that I'm finding is still in the State of the Edge org.
Yes, the Linux Foundation hasn't yet helped me move it over to theirs, but okay. It does have the Creative Commons license, and we've turned the IP over to the Linux Foundation.
Great.
Yeah, I think that sounds good, and it'd be good to actually do that work and
just Steve Wong privately messaged me saying he'd like to be involved. So we already have someone from this group in addition to me that wants to participate. But the more the merrier.
Yeah, great.
Hi, this is Harald. Sorry, I had problems with Zoom.
Hey, Harold, we can hear you.
Okay.
Did you have anything to add to this topic?
I actually only joined right now, so I didn't get the point.
Okay, no worries. Yeah. So yeah, maybe this is a good segue into another topic, and so we had a EclipseCon Europe this week with the IoT day there, and Harald actually had a lightning talk on the edge use case within the Siemens and some of the problems they are tackling there. So I propose that maybe next week he can give us a similar presentation for this group, and maybe we can see how to proceed with this. But to me it looks like one of it could be based for one of the use cases that we want to tackle. So maybe actually start organizing around that, what we were talking that we want to do. So for some of the use cases defined, start to creating reference architectures, blueprints, demo deployments, and things like that. But maybe just start with the presentation next week and see what everybody thinks about it.
So you mean in 2 weeks, Dejan, right?
In 2 weeks, yeah.
So yeah, happy to share.
What do the rest of the group thinks?
Yeah.
Any objections?
No, I mean, it was great when Cindy presented Cube Edge. So I think anything we can do to kind of use this group as a chance to get a preview of what's happening in the member sort of sub ecosystems. I'd be happy to at some point things are still too early for me to do so, but our own kind of edge offering is continuing to build. So I'd love to give you guys a preview of that a little bit down the road. So if we can use that as kind of a regular part of the
yeah, whenever we have some new material. That was my thoughts as well. So okay, we can put it on the agenda for the next week then, right?
Yeah.
Yeah, I'd like to see Preston's presentation, sure.
One anecdote that I think this group would be kind of interested in is we had one of our cloud summits in London a couple weeks ago, and I had a chance to talk to Kelsey Hightower a bit about some of the edge and Kubernetes stuff, and I'm sure most of you know his name from the Kubernetes side of things. But it's interesting because he had an earlier career at Google in the data center team, in earlier stages of data center, where he did a lot of bare metal configuring of servers, et cetera. And so we talked about, I think one of the things that's most fundamental to what makes Kubernetes for edge different than other environments is that you're often dealing with the bare metal problems of starting from scratch and with a few machines. And he, if you know his style, he sort of poo-poos complexity to the extreme. So his point was around how you can get a simple sort of 3 to 5 node Kubernetes cluster on bare metal going by not trying to come up with fancy base images, et cetera, and just doing a degree of hard coding of IP addresses and network ports, and then have a PXE boot, and DHCP. So I think part of what I think is an interesting space to explore in the realm of Kubernetes on the edge is the lifecycle management part at the beginning, right? How do we make it easier for an OT environment group who's not going to be able to assume that things like VMware are running on a large cluster already? How do they get, a brand new sort of 3 to 5 node sort of mini Kubernetes cluster up and running? And KubeAdmin has made big improvements in that, but I think there's still a bunch of interesting stuff that maybe this group can kind of contribute to that isn't already covered by some of the other SIGs.
Yeah, my experience talking to people is you already everything you've said started with this premise of a 3 to 5 node, but I'm talking to people who are talking about 1 and 2 node systems.
Sure.
And you also dropped that line of a large VMware cluster, but there are plenty of people, people have been using VMware and other hypervisors for a decade now at edge locations, and it doesn't have to be a large cluster. I personally would recommend 2 at least, but it doesn't have to be that many nodes. And I feel that actually, if you get down to a really small node count, like 1 or 2 physical nodes, there's a compelling advantage to having a hypervisor. The key to getting high availability is redundancy. And once you start dropping your services on bare metal, you can't have multiple instances of the OS by definition. So patching the OS becomes problematic. And I think as you go lower in terms of physical node count, there might be a case for being a stronger argument for running on a hypervisor of some sort. I don't mean to plug my own employer's product. It could be anybody's hypervisor, but being able to have triple redundancy on your etcd gives you the operational advantage of being able to patch these without taking an outage. And doing that, granted, you could run multiple instances of a service on top of Linux itself, or multiple containerized instances of etcd, but you're still going to have to do kernel patches. And having the hypervisor there gives you a means to do that and perhaps stage the new version before the older one has been taken off the air, and recover from tricky things like an attempted update that gets halfway through. And that can be a real bad day at an unattended site.
I definitely am not disagreeing with that at all. I think, but even when you do have the sort of benefit of being able to inject a hypervisor layer into your system, you still have the bootstrap problem, right? Which is, how do you get the how do you start from?
Yeah, and firmware, but the thing with the hypervisor is that many of them would allow you to migrate from one node to another. So that if you have, granted, you can't do this on single node, but if you have 2, you can potentially temporarily migrate your critical workloads off of one so that you can even do a firmware patch on the hardware itself.
Yeah, no, in fact, Steve, I don't know if you have any pointers to kind of docs or outlines of how one sort of operationalizes many small installations of sort of VMware, where you have to figure out a way to economize the setup time because you're doing it for such a small investment of nodes.
Yeah,
I'm much more familiar with it being deployed, in an environment where you put any amount of effort into it because you're actually relying on VMware for a very large management task.
Right. I think that the search terms, you might need to find those. Like I say, people have been using that for years, and before the term edge became popular. So they're often perhaps more discoverable looking for robo, like remote office, branch office, and terms like that, rather than terms like edge and IoT. But those are out there. And then, of course, it being a commercial product, it could be that some of these knowledge-based things are somewhat shielded behind, corporate websites, but they are out there. I think a big problem, in addition to just patching, is actually the scale of this. I've seen people come up with a demo of, using kind of moderate automation to deploy a 3 to 5 node system in just an instance of one. But I think the bigger problem is, what do you do if you want 10,000 of these and, manage them at an enormous scale, and then get some that drift over time as well? Realistically, somebody putting out 10,000 or even 1,000 locations isn't going to do it in one big bang and then update the hardware and platform in one big bang incident. They're going to have a lot of non-uniformity in terms of what's out there at those edge locations. And it I think that when you architect a means to administer these remotely at scale, you have to assume that there's going to be differences in each of these nodes, which makes the problem tougher. I'm not saying it's solved, but it's not completely unaddressed. And one of the interesting things about this group is I think we can bring a lot to the table to make this, make this a better world. So if you don't mind, in the agenda, I added an item just to do a recap of what I found. I just came back. I'm pretty jet lagged after 20 hours of travel, but I gave a presentation of Kubernetes at Edge at Open Source Summit in Edinburgh. And if anybody's interested, I put a link to the deck in the notes, and I can give a recap of that when we want to fit it in.
Absolutely, and I was thinking to ask you to give you the presentation to this group, or share the video of your talk when it become available, because yeah, I think it's a great topic.
Yeah, they didn't record it, and I think I shared earlier that blog post that went on the Kubernetes.io blog. So their format was 35 minutes for the presentation, and to be honest, that deck is merely a subset of what was in the blog. Yeah. So if you were to read the blog, you perhaps aren't going to get a lot out of looking at the deck, because it was an attempt to condense it down. But some of the discussions afterward and the people who showed up with interest in the topic were perhaps more interesting. I would describe at least you can't tell everyone in the audience, but a group of us took it into the kind of a long hallway discussion afterward, and it was almost all telecommunications people that were interested in this topic. And I can't say that if I was to summarize it, it's not like they're on Kubernetes now. They're thinking they might like to go there and have a need for something like it, is the way I describe it. I also met somebody from EdgeX Foundry, which is an attempt to deliver and manage at scale containerized applications for IoT and Edge. And they expressed an interest in this problem of bootstrapping is something they're encountering too. And the organizer of this EdgeX Foundry came to me saying that they've been looking at Kubernetes as perhaps an attempt to help them address this bootstrap problem Preston was alluding to, thinking that we had all the answers already. And it was, I don't know, in a way kind of funny that both sides, I went to an EdgeX Foundry hoping that maybe they had some magical solution for the bootstrap problem. But there might be some value in even that group getting involved. So a lot of these people said they would be joining this group, but that conference didn't end until yesterday. So I suspect that many of them didn't travel that evening and are off the air today.
Yeah, that's a great feedback, and yeah, I think this week there was like 5 or 6 big conferences all around the world. So I'm surprised that we have this much attendance at all this week. So yeah,
Barcelona last week as well.
Yeah. I think everybody is trying to squeeze into this short window of couple of weeks of October and November. Yeah.
When you said, Stephen, they were interested in kind of Kubernetes in this sort of abstract, thing, were they? Do you think they were conflating literal Kubernetes as like a running cluster with pods, et cetera, versus sort of adopting Kubernetes design patterns to other things that they're in their operation?
Let's define the they, because there were 2 groups, the telcos and the EdgeX Foundry. So I'm going to go with the telcos.
Yeah.
So the telcos have this vision. I can't speak for every one of them, but a lot of them were talking about a new world of LTE-5, bringing very good connectivity out to edge locations. And they've already got things like cell towers and switching offices that would be capable of hosting some compute that moves out to the edge to take advantage of latency advantages and resiliency, where that link between the sensors and the data they're collecting is thought to be far more reliable than getting that up to a central cloud location or a small handful of central cloud locations. And they have this vision. They need to host their own compute and software-defined switching workload for sure. So they're paying for those, let's call them mini data centers, if you will. You know, they're not going to be AWS-like or Google-like data centers, but they are still data centers. And they've already gotten used to this problem. They actually gave me a reference to a book saying that one of them was lamenting the fact that over in the compute side, there's a bunch of redefinitions of terms related to high availability that they deem to have been solved problems. And I posted the link to that book, I think, in the Slack of this group. But they said that there are people who appear to be reinventing things over on our side of the world that the telcos viewed as solved problems in the 90s. And there might be some truth to that. I'm going to go get that book myself. But they had two things that they were interested in. They think the workloads they're going to deploy at these locations will be containerized, and they will be remotely managed. And, you know, that should start you on a path if you do a search for existing technology where Kubernetes pops up as a possible solution. So that's kind of the stage it's at. They also are concerned with issues like, well, Cindy's topic brought up the subject of leaf node to leaf node data communications, where they don't want to do hairpins up to the central cloud. The state of Kubernetes for that, I think, is perhaps open. They're not convinced Kubernetes would work for them, but they're looking at it. And that's kind of the stage they're in. And after hearing them talk about their needs, it sounds like, you know, one of the issues with Kubernetes is people often come up with this initial approach that gets shot down of the Kubernetes control plane being in the public cloud managing worker nodes remotely. But there's a big issue with that, not just the scale, but the current limit. I think the current Kubernetes limit is 5,000 nodes, and that isn't enough for those kind of use cases. How secure that path is and what happens when that path goes out. You know, they'd really prefer a situation where it's what in the control world would be called supervisory control, where the central puts it in a desired state, but you could perhaps lose your communication to that central for hours, maybe even days, and still continue to operate and even recover from power cycling. And I'm not sure that the current state of Kubernetes, if you put your control plane up at the central cloud and simple worker nodes down at those edge locations, is up to that mission. Maybe we could get it there, but I don't think it's there today. Anyway, did that answer your question?
I think that goes back to that the cluster federation still is in a very early state of Kubernetes. I think
right.
That's the reason why people would manage their cloud to edge clusters out of the public cloud.
And I'm not sure that what went down in the existing so-called cluster federation is likely up to this now either. I mean, a lot of the people there for cluster administration were thinking about managing a cluster in one region and maybe a couple in two other regions, but not a scale of tens of thousands or hundreds of thousands. And that is a completely different beast.
Yeah, I mean, at least in Google, our efforts are to move more towards multi-cluster management than federated clusters. Because the initial sort of federated control plane just didn't work, because there ended up being so much reduplication of everything. You know, every time you added something to sort of the regular Kubernetes API, then you had to kind of have this federated flavor of it. I think it just became unwieldy. The reason I asked about that, you know, whether people were looking at Kubernetes as a literal versus an analogy to their world, is because we earlier this week we had kind of we have an annual internal alphabet, like pan-alphabet wide IoT summit that brings in, you know, Nest and the hardware team and the cloud team, and one of the groups is our internal smart building group. And this guy, colleague Trevor, he's in the past used software-defined networking as sort of a comparison for some of the building problems, and he's now trying to switch to using Kubernetes as an analogy, because it's dealing with, you know, the control and orchestration of all these different pieces. But it got us onto a conversation which made me think of one of the other opportunities for Kubernetes and the edge is to use the CoreOS operator pattern, right? This idea of taking a custom resource in Kubernetes as a control plane orchestrator, but whose actions are taken entirely on external things. So an operator running in Kubernetes on the edge, whose actions are all taken on, say, things like building management systems and other external to the cluster systems, but still the logic of the operator running in the cluster. I don't know if that's something anyone else has kind of come across in conversations, but.
Well, I like that idea for contemplation, and yeah, at Open Source Summit, I think that the telcos are completely uncommitted. They like what they see on Kubernetes on kind of the collateral tool chain is something that if you get an API that is Kubernetes-like enough, maybe you can continue to utilize all of this collateral activity that's one of the highest velocity open source things going on the planet. And if you went off on your own in something just a little different for a little more advantage, it's probably not worth it. You'd have to have, you know, to not use that Kubernetes API to a degree where you could utilize some of this other tool chain collateral, you'd need a really good reason. And yet they're just doing the evaluation to make the decision. It didn't appear to me that anyone has made a decision yet. Sounds a lot like that internal discussion group you had.
I mean, the building team is just dealing with so much heterogeneity and legacy, which is kind of par for the course in a lot of edge environments, right? And so
right.
The idea for a telco, for example, to say, look, you don't have to basically port everything to Kubernetes to take advantage of some of what Kubernetes offers, right? If you have ways to interact with these legacy systems and you're simply trying to add more kind of same controller logic, you can deploy, you know, some sort of custom resource in Kubernetes in the operator pattern that you can still take actions on, where that can become part of your new control surface. And as you over time migrate things into more sort of software defined or rewrite different things, you can just integrate that into the operator instead of having to call out to whatever n number of adapters to your kind of legacy backnet whatever system.
Yeah, there seems to be a lot of advantage to that concept of managing things that doesn't itself have to be an architected object inside the, you know, Kubernetes or whatever itself. Yeah, I'd agree with that. In fact, you know, some of the things that obviously are issues where Kubernetes isn't ready to go, in my opinion, and others, are even things with dealing with mixed architectures of compute. You know, a lot of the assumptions in Kubernetes right now not only contend that you've got similar CPUs within the worker node cluster, but same architecture, x86, ARM, whatever. But in these edge things, I think you're going to be a lot less homogeneous, and it isn't clear how well, if at all, Kubernetes is prepared to deal with that.
Although I've done some experiments with node taints and traits for architecture. So I guess I'm curious where things actually break, because I think there's some primitives that can be used for that kind of thing.
Yeah, but it's almost like maybe a little too Band-Aid like, where you have to engage in non-default manual configuration
Right.
to a large degree. And I don't know, it would be better if somehow that was sort of built into the nervous system so that it doesn't have to go up to the conscious brain to
Yeah, I mean, for
be taken
example,
care of.
you cannot create a multi-architecture Kubernetes deployment resource, right? Because you're referencing an image is going to be bound to a certain architecture. So sort of the best you can sort of do is have two deployments, one for ARM, one for x86, and then use node taints and traits so that they only run on the nodes of the matching architecture. So as you say, that feels very ugly. It gets it done, right? But it feels like it's forcing a lot of extra, you know, kind of grossness.
Yeah, and then even, you know, you're going to want to bring in things like, you know, one of the things they're looking at Kubernetes for is image distribution, and you're going to start looking at image repositories, maybe even Helm chart repositories or something like Helm charts. And it isn't clear how well they addressed a mixed architecture scenario either. You can certainly use, I guess you could use independent clusters, but if you've got components, maybe some data collection that are on ARM that has to work with process compute that's on x86 and engage in an update that would boost the version of both of those at the same time, it would be nice if the platform could address that.
While we're on this topic, this is Matt Trifiro again. Did I lose you guys?
No,
No, we can hear you.
Oh, sorry. Yeah, I guess my Zoom canceled up. I still have the audio call. Two things. One is my day job is 100% focused on deploying data centers tightly integrated with the telco infrastructure. We've got 5 up in Chicago now. So I can talk at great length on this subject with a tremendous amount of knowledge. So if
I guess I'd be happy if anybody on this call would like to put yourself on the agenda to talk about something on, you know, a future meeting of this group. That'd be great. I guess it isn't up to me. I'm not the chair of the group, but you know, go for it. I think we're pretty informal. So if you just go add future dates to that running agenda notes document and put yourself down with a time estimate of how long you need, I'd say go for it. I think that somebody from the EdgeX Foundry group did want to perhaps talk at this group and give a presentation. I'm not sure anybody from any of the telcos was prepared to do that.
Yeah, so I'll put some time on the agenda in a future meeting to talk about telco infrastructure, and I'll bring someone who actually is from that side of the world as well. Also, there are at least a couple of software companies, startups, that are doing really interesting things with Kubernetes on the edge. They aren't, you know, they're kind of spread thin, so participating in this group hasn't been a priority for them. But one of them is Rafe Systems, and I think we should invite Haseeb Budani. He's ex-Akamai. Because I've talked to him at length, and the work he's doing, he's actually very interested in contributing it to the foundation, you know, and or upstreaming some of it. So I think from an architectural standpoint, he probably has some.
They're a group doing Kubernetes at Edge and don't have time for this group. Where else do they have time for? I mean, that sounds like this is basically their business.
Well, I agree. I mean, yeah, I mean, they're trying to build product. So, but I agree, and he's had some intersection with the CNCF, and I'm happy to have him come to this. I'll try to schedule him for this group to do a short presentation, or at least lead a discussion.
How do you spell Rafe Systems?
Rafay, and I think it's Rafe.io. I think they're largely stealth, but if you read their blog, you can kind of get a sense of what they're trying to do.
I see Cindy popped in on the notes saying her audio doesn't work, but before we run out of time, one of the things I wanted to bring up was that some of us, I think, are going to KubeCon Shanghai, and maybe we can arrange to physically meet at some point during that event. Maybe if since Cindy's speaker is down, maybe we can just set up a block in the notes for people who want to meet at KubeCon Shanghai to just put their name down.
Yeah, and I think Chris also mentioned on Slack that they want to have some media coverage for the group there. So it would be great if you guys that are going to attend that, we should try to get in touch with Chris and see if we can help with anything there. We don't have any formal session, but any informal thing that we can do there, it'd be good. And just to add to the previous discussion, I agree with Preston that operator framework could be a really good good tool for solving some of these issues. I think, yeah, something we should try to dig into.
I'm gonna kind of just, I saw Adam, you add your name to the notes, and coming from Docker. I don't know that I've heard Docker's kind of quick summary, the concise version of what is Docker sort of thinking about Edge explicitly as far as Notary or other places you think Docker stuff is particularly gonna be relevant on the Edge, beyond kind of where it's relevant everywhere.
Yeah, so it's my first time joining this call, so it's a good opportunity for me to say hello. Yeah, so Adam from Docker. I'm Director of Engineering for Edge and IoT. We are looking at extending our stack, tools and services to the Edge, and I guess beyond as much as possible. We're working with some early customers in extending the platform to support their requirements, and I wanted to join this group, or at least sit on the calls for the short term here to get some input, I guess, from the industry, and then see how Kubernetes can be leveraged and what everyone's kind of working towards. We're still building out our roadmap for, I guess, advanced features, but we do have some offerings today that can meet some use cases in the Edge. And then we're going to be expanding to, I guess, less Docker style Edge deployments in the near future.
One question I wonder if you guys already have, because it's not exclusive to the Edge, but maybe particularly useful to the Edge, is some caching proxy for private registries. Do you have sort of a pass-through caching? Where basically you have a bunch of systems on the Edge that are pulling containers through this proxy, and if it has it cached, it'll just use that, and if it doesn't, it'll have to go up to a cloud-hosted registry, maybe precede it. Any of those kind of patterns you guys are?
Well,
Yeah.
The Harbor repository, they don't call it caching so much, but as replication. But I think that might be just exactly what you might be looking for. That's now a CNCF project, but it was initiated at VMware. It does not only container images, but Helm charts as well, as of the version that came out a few weeks ago.
So Preston, to answer your question, yeah, we have a Docker trusted registry, and you can mirror them and chain them. And there's like a true mirror, and there's also caching. Depending on the customer requirements or the topology you're looking for, it can be basically like a pure HTTP cache style, or a fully mirrored repo. So that works today.
But yeah, that's an interesting topic, because what you often want to have is some sort of governance on that as well, along with audit logs, so you can tell what images ended up going to where, and not indiscriminately replicate anything. But I'd encourage you, Preston, to just go take a look at Harbor. I'll see if I can.
Oh, it's already booked. I've already got it.
Okay.
I'm gonna look at it, because one of the things when I looked at in the kind of not only related to the caching side, but the whole, I feel like Kubernetes unfortunately punted on content trust, and Docker has Notary, Red Hat has simple image signing, and Kubernetes itself doesn't really have a nice clean way of doing content trust. And I think it's just one of those things that's enhanced in edge environments, because you are potentially running on your overall sort of trust in the infrastructure is a little bit less, right? So physical security of the machines may be a little less. You may want to make sure that no one's kind of injecting in other image content. But from what I've been able to tell, Kubernetes kind of punted, unfortunately, on that.
Yeah, I think they just declared that it was outside the bounds, and maybe that they didn't need to, that the existing infrastructure for these image repositories was fine. And when it was architected, they didn't start as the leading orchestrator. So I think arguably Docker was in that position at the time, so that the Docker image repository was a force of nature, not to be, if they immediately started to propose to replace that, the willingness of the world to uptake Kubernetes would have been reduced. So I'll forgive them what happened, but I think that is my historical observation of how that came about. I think there's more to this than just signing too, by the way, that vulnerability scanning is a key piece of this. It's just like antivirus, where many times there are these latent security weaknesses that aren't discovered until months or years later. Yet you want to have some inventory of what your risk is. If this has been out there, where has it been used and for how long, just so that you can go conduct investigations to try to constrain potential damage.
One interesting new feature that Docker has in beta right now is we've extended Docker Content Trust to the edge in the engine. So the engine now does signature verification on images, and will only run it with the correct trust pinning. So that's in public beta right now, and we'll be announcing soon.
And that's all Notary based, I'm assuming.
Yes, it is.
Hey, Adam, I'd be interested in understanding how the Docker caching works. Do you set up, is that a configuration in the Docker engine, or do you point to the cache?
That's a good question. I'm definitely not an expert in that. I think you point to the cache, but I'd have to double check for you.
Okay.
Okay, so I might think that discussions about the KubeCon presentations will leave for another dedicated meeting for the people that will be there, because these general discussions are much more valuable to the whole group. So maybe Cindy, Steve, Preston, we can do it sometime next week or something like that. I know there's one thing, for example, June wanted to join us, so we should see how to organize more about that, but we don't have time for that on this call. So maybe we should do it in a dedicated call and start preparing for the sessions in Seattle. You guys agree?
Yep. No, I think that sounds good. And maybe we start with just the Slack DM when you started there. Yeah,
perfect. And I think, the last thing that I wanted to see, how do we better document all these resources and materials that we find out throughout the conversations and the meetings, just so that they don't get lost in the Slack threads and things like that. So maybe a GitHub page or something like that. Do you guys have any preferences, any good experiences so far? So far, I put most of them as references in the white papers. It can work for a while, but it might even get something better.
Honestly, it's that kind of like curating of something as vast as what we're talking about in kind of Kubernetes. I just feel like it's going to be it just becomes untenable from a curatorial point of view. At some point, I mean, honestly, the best of those kind of things are when people sort of do these, the sort of dash awesome lists in GitHub. But it's you're basically curating the internet at that point.
Yeah. I get what you're saying. Yeah. Okay. Let's leave it at this then, because there's enough time, enough things to do already within this group.
Yeah, I'm hoping that as sort of the run up to the KubeCon talk, we can sort of potentially come up with some light stack ranking of which of the problems is got a sort of a rubric that results in us ranking it as something that is both impactful and solvable to some degree, as a way of actually doing a little bit of work towards, kind of an illustrated reference of how to solve that type of problem, right? So just to make it, to pair a little bit of here's the interesting challenges with here's at least a way to think about solving that kind of problem with Kubernetes. So whether that's an example of an operator calling into a legacy thing or something around the, events, converting events to service discovery, or the networking in QoS, any of these things that we have kind of now inventoried, be interesting for the sake of even doing a quick demo during the talk as well.
Yeah, I think maybe that's where Harald's presentation next time will be valuable, because it uses, taints and edge labels just to, move workloads between the nodes. So that's one, like not to say low-hanging fruit, but definitely valid use case and something to think about in this context.
And Harald, if those are available to share in advance, if you can jam them into the notes, happy to kind of click through the slides if those are posted.
I can see what I can make available.
Great.
Okay, I think that would be it for this week. I think, great meeting.
Yeah, thanks for sharing, everyone.
I really enjoyed it. Yeah. See you all on Slack.
Thank you. Goodbye.